My grandmother taught me many things, lessons that are part of the fabric of my life, ingrained within my very bones. Some of those lessons have served me well, and there are still some that I'm still unlearning. And I have to tell you that the unlearning is far harder, far more difficult than carrying forward the lessons that have served me well. But still, the most important lesson that my grandmother taught me was mending. There is so much in our world that is in need of mending. And today we turn our attention to mending relationships with our Indigenous siblings, relationships that have been torn and broken by the empire building of white European colonizers. My grandmother taught me the importance of mending and repairing things that were torn and broken, returning them to useful life. In the evening, after a long day of helping my mother with 4 unruly children, after the dishes had been washed and put away, after all the baths had been taken and all the teeth had been brushed, my grandmother would take out her mending basket and sit on the couch. In the basket, there were balls of finely spun yarn, scissors, darning needles, a darning egg, and a pile of socks with holes worn in the heels. I watched her arthritic hands as she worked, hands that were twisted and gnarled at the joints from all the times they had been frostbitten by bitter cold winds that blew across the plains of North Dakota, which is where she had spent most of her life. First, she would stretch a sock over the smooth wooden surface of the darning egg until it was positioned perfectly under the hole in the sock. Then she would thread a needle with the yarn that matched the color of the sock the best. Carefully, she would place the needle in the fabric near the edge of the hole, but not too close, but where the integrity of the fabric was still strong enough to hold the knot at the end of the yarn. Next, she laid the thread over the curved surface of the darning egg until it reached the other side of the hole. And then again, she would place the needle close, but not too close to the hole's edge, and then repeat the process, moving from side to side of the hole, creating something that looked a little bit like the warp on a loom, paying attention to the length of each thread, that it lay perfectly across the surface of the egg, not too loose and not too tight. And when the entire expanse of the hole was covered, she would turn the sock and repeat the process from the other direction, this time guiding the needle over one strand of yarn and under the next, again and again, until a patch of fabric covered the hole in the sock, fabric created by my grandmother's arthritic hands, a needle and a single strand of yarn. I will confess that I don't darn socks. In fact, I don't do much in the way of mending clothing other than periodically sewing on a button that has fallen off or resewing a seam that has come apart. Still, I hold on to the memory of sitting next to my grandmother, watching her darn socks. I cherish those times of closeness with her, even as I remember the many things that I learned from her that I am still working to unlearn. I'm still unlearning attitudes that my grandmother held about the Indigenous peoples, Mandan, Hadassah, and Arikara, who lived on the land that is now known as the Spirit Lake Reservation, people who had originally inhabited the land my grandmother had grown up on, and the farm that was acquired through the Homestead Act by my grandfather's family in 1888. Actually, it would be my great-grandfather. But my grandmother and her family was taught to fear the native peoples. In an article titled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," authors Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang state that in order for the settlers to make a place their home, they must destroy and disappear the indigenous peoples that live there. For my settler ancestors, they had to do that. And as a result, they learned to fear and despise the indigenous people, attitudes that they passed on to their descendants, attitudes that must be unlearned, along with the false narratives taught to me and my peers, and I suspect many of you sitting here today in the public education system. According to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is the author of a book that many of you read and studied together, An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, there are more than 500 federally recognized indigenous communities and nations. These are the descendants of the 15 million original inhabitants of the land, the majority of whom were farmers who lived in towns, just as my ancestors were farmers who lived in towns. It is a hard truth, then, that my ancestors actively displaced indigenous peoples from their homes and were part of what can only be called a genocide. Healing can only begin when there is an accurate diagnosis. And I tell you these stories not to center my experience or make it about me. I tell you these stories because I suspect that for many, but not all of you here, but those who, like me, are of white European descent, my stories may resonate with your own. In telling these stories, I also recognize that it is a privilege that I know my family history, because it is well documented. It hasn't been destroyed. My family history is well documented when the histories of too many indigenous families have been eradicated. And I tell you these stories so that those of us who are not indigenous to this land not fall prey to what is described in Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book as a race to innocence, which is what occurs when individuals assume that they are innocent of complicity in structures of domination and oppression in a settler society that has not come to terms with its past. Whatever historical trauma was entailed in the settling of the land affects the assumptions and behavior of living generations at any given time, including immigrants and children of recent immigrants. In other words, this healing work belongs to all of us. On those evenings when I would watch my grandmother mend socks, I remember times when she would pull out all of the stitches that she had made, and sometimes she would cut out an entire patch, even though she'd spent an hour or more making it, cutting it out because it just wasn't quite right, and starting over. In doing that, she taught me something about the work of unlearning and undoing what is not right. My grandmother could only mend one sock at a time, and she could only mend that one sock one stitch at a time. And the work of mending for her took focused time and attention, and it took sustained practice to become skilled at the work. And so it is with us, as a justice-seeking community committed to the work of repair. And as we think about how we might begin this work of repair, I offer some possibilities for actions, kind of like those small stitches that each of us can take as we live into this commitment. One is continue to unlearn and relearn. A good place to start is Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And you'll find there a bibliography of resources for further study. Another action you can take is to learn the history of your own family's relationship to the land. And I recognize that's more difficult for some of you than others. But see what you can learn about your own family's history and their relationship to the land. And then learn the local history here in Middle Tennessee. And then from what is learned, my hope is that we can write yet another new land acknowledgement, one that reflects the best of what is known. We're not quite there yet. The statement I talked about last week is really more a statement of commitment to the work of repair than it is a land acknowledgement. So that statement is going to continue to guide the justice work that we are undertaking at this congregation, but we're going to continue to work on a land acknowledgement statement to be included in our worship. So part of the known history of the area near this church is that there are 6,000 Yuchi stone box burials that date to the 1400s, and they are along Browns Creek, Castilian Springs, and the Cellar Farm town site. A possible action that we can take is to partner with the Nashville Friends Meeting in an effort to raise the needed funds, which is approximately $2,700, to place a state historical marker for the Yuchi stone box burial sites. And being that my remaining time with you is short and growing shorter, I can only plant these seeds and water them. To carry any actions forward, it depends on you. Talk with each other. Talk about your family histories. Talk about what you know, what you've learned, what you have unlearned and are trying to relearn. Talk to your social justice team and your beloved community team about what actions you can commit to. For this is the work of mending, anchoring the threads of relationship, reaching across the torn places, anchoring the threads in places of integrity, not in pain or fear or shame or guilt, but in places of love and compassion and empathy, and the ongoing quest for true and lasting peace and justice. I want to thank Tom Ganesh for his thoughtful conversations that he has had with me, one of our Indigenous neighbors, and for many resources that have informed my thinking and have deepened my unlearning and relearning process. In closing today, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz writes this: Indigenous peoples offer possibilities for a life after empire, possibilities that neither erase the crimes of colonialism nor require the disappearance of the original people colonized under the guise of including them as individuals. That process rightfully starts by honoring the treaties of the United States that were made with the indigenous nations, by restoring all sacred sites, starting with the Black Hills, and including most federally held parks and land and all stolen sacred items and body parts, and by payment of sufficient reparations for the reconstruction and expansion of Native nations. She goes on to say this, and this for me is the hopeful part. In the process, the continent will be radically reconfigured, physically and psychologically. For the future to be realized, it will require extensive educational programs and the full support and active participation of the descendants of settlers, enslaved Africans, and colonized Mexicans, as well as immigrant populations. In the words of the Acoma poet Simon Ortiz, the future will not be mad with loss and waste, though the memory will be there. Eyes will become kind and deep, and the bones of this nation will mend after the revolution. May it be so, my friends. May it be so.